They told me I was nothing. Not in a dramatic way. Not in a speech meant to break my spirit. Just the quiet kind of nothing people say when they think a person's life has already been decided. I was 16 years old when Mrs. Hargrove stood at the front of the dormitory with a thin envelope in her hand and 20 girls behind me waiting for breakfast. She read the letter twice before she spoke my name. Voss. She said it the way people say a word they don't quite trust. Then she told me a lawyer in Beckley had written to inform the orphanage that my great-aunt had died and left me property. The room was quiet for about 2 seconds. Then someone laughed. It started small, just one girl near the window. But laughter spreads quickly when people are relieved it isn't about them. By the time Mrs. Hargrove folded the letter again, the entire dormitory was laughing. Not cruelly, just the way people laugh when something sounds ridiculous. Because the property I had inherited was not a house, not money, not land anyone wanted. It was a sealed limestone cave somewhere in the mountains of West Virginia. 12 acres of hollow land around it and nothing else. Mrs. Hargrove looked at me and shook her head slightly like someone watching a child believe in a fairy tale. Well, she said, I suppose even the dead can play jokes. That was the moment something in me hardened. I had lived in that orphanage since I was 9. My mother had died from tuberculosis. My father disappeared one afternoon and never returned. For 7 years, I slept in a narrow bed between girls who came and went like seasons. Some were adopted. Some were sent away to work. Some simply vanished from records. The only thing that stayed constant was the quiet understanding that girls like us were meant to live small lives. So, clean, work in kitchens, be grateful. Mrs. Hargrove liked to say curiosity was dangerous in girls. She said girls who asked too many questions grew dissatisfied with the lives meant for them. I asked questions anyway. I read every book that came through the donation boxes. Science textbooks, gardening manuals, old farming pamphlets, anything with diagrams and explanations. I hid them under my mattress like contraband. That morning, standing there while the other girls laughed, I remember thinking one simple thing. A cave was still better than the life they had already chosen for me. 3 days later, I left the orphanage with a small suitcase, a coat that wasn't warm enough for the mountains, and the address of a lawyer named Mr. Aldridge. He met me at the Beckley bus station. Sinmun, kind eyes, the sort of man who speaks carefully so people won't feel rushed. He looked surprised when he realized I had come alone. You're younger than I expected, he said. I told him I didn't have anyone else to come with me. He nodded once, the way adults do when they realize a conversation has reached a place where politeness matters more than questions. The truck ride into the mountains took almost an hour. The road grew smaller with every mile. Pavement turned to gravel. Gravel turned to mud. By the time we reached the hollow, the sunlight barely touched the ground through the trees. Mr. Aldridge parked beside a broken fence and shut off the engine. Your aunt lived here alone for 40 years, he said. Maren Voss. I had never heard the name before that morning in the orphanage. According to Mr. Aldridge, people in town thought she was strange. She studied plants, soil, underground water. She wrote letters to universities that rarely answered her. When she died, only 3 people attended the funeral. Mr. Aldridge opened the back seat of the truck and handed me a thick leather journal held closed with a strap. She left this for family, he said. The cover read, Notes on the Cultivation of Life in Darkness. Maren Voss, 1901 to 1937. The words made no sense to me at the time. Cultivation of Life in Darkness sounded like poetry or madness. Mr. Aldridge then pointed toward the hillside. At first I didn't see it. The entrance was half hidden behind wild vines and rhododendron. A wooden door set directly into the rock. A heavy iron padlock hung from a chain across the handles. Mr. Aldridge handed me a rusted key. The cave goes back around 200 feet, he said. Your aunt sealed it before she died. I remember standing there with that key in my hand, feeling 2 completely different things at the same time. Fear and something else. Something hotter. Curiosity. The kind of curiosity that had gotten me in trouble my entire childhood. You don't have to open it today, Mr. Aldridge said. But I already knew I would. The lock resisted at first. Rust had eaten into the metal. I had to push hard enough that the key bent slightly before the mechanism finally snapped loose. The sound echoed strangely against the rock. I pulled the door open slowly. The air that came out of the cave smelled like damp stone and old earth. I lit the kerosene lantern Mr. Aldridge had brought and stepped inside. What I saw made me stop breathing for a moment, because Maren Voss had not left me a cave. She had left me a garden, not the kind of garden you see in fields. This was something stranger. The main chamber stretched wider than I expected. Stone beds built carefully across the floor. Water channels carved through the limestone, guiding slow trickles of underground seepage toward the beds. And above all of it, mounted along the ceiling and angled carefully toward a narrow shaft near the entrance, dozens of mirrors. Some cracked, some fogged with age, but still positioned with a precision that told me this had not been built by accident. When a lantern light moved across the ceiling, I could see exactly what Maren had done. She had turned the cave itself into a machine designed to capture sunlight and carry it deeper underground. I walked slowly through the chamber, touching the edges of the stone beds with my fingers. They were empty now. Whatever Maren had grown here had been harvested long before she died. But the soil was still dark and soft. Alive in a way I had never felt soil before. I sat down on the cave floor with the journal in my hands and opened the first page. The handwriting was small and careful. The first sentence read, "They will tell you that nothing grows in the dark. They are wrong. The dark is where all seeds begin." I read that line 3 times before I realized something that made my heart beat faster. Maren Voss hadn't been hiding in this hollow for 40 years. She had been experimenting. The mirrors, the water channels, the temperature of the cave. Everything had been designed for one purpose: growing food underground. Mr. Aldridge stepped inside behind me and held the lantern higher. "Did you find something?" he asked. I nodded slowly, but I didn't explain, because in that moment I understood something about my life that no one in the orphanage had ever imagined. They had spent 7 years telling me curiosity was dangerous. That questions led nowhere. That girls like me should learn to stop asking why. But in that cave, surrounded by Maren's work, I felt something I had never felt before. Not hope exactly. Something stronger. Possibility. That night, I slept in the small cabin beside the cave entrance. The roof leaked in 3 places. The stove barely worked. Mice had claimed the mattress long before I arrived. I had almost no food except a few jars of old beans in the cellar. The mountains were colder than I expected. By midnight, I was wrapped in 2 coats and still shaking. Lying there in the dark, I thought about the girls back at the orphanage sleeping in their warm beds. It would have been easy to leave, easy to walk back down the road and tell Mr. Aldridge I had made a mistake. But the image of that cave kept returning to my mind. The mirrors, the soil, the journal. Maren had spent 40 years building something no one believed in, and somehow she had left it to me. I fell asleep just before dawn with one thought repeating quietly in the back of my mind. If she had been right, if something really could grow in that darkness, then maybe the world had been wrong about more than just plants. Maybe they had been wrong about me too. The next morning, I carried Maren's journal into the cave and began reading it from the beginning. I didn't know it then, but that moment, sitting on the cold limestone floor with a lantern beside me, was the moment the rest of my life truly started. Because inside that journal were 40 years of observations, experiments, failures, breakthroughs, and a single idea powerful enough to change everything. Maren believed that the cave's constant temperature could protect plants through the winter. She believed the limestone could feed minerals into the soil through the water seepage. And most importantly, she believed the mirror system could bring enough sunlight underground to keep certain crops alive. It sounded impossible, but as I sat there reading her notes, I realized something that made me smile for the first time since leaving the orphanage. Impossible had never stopped Maren Voss. And for the first time in my life, impossible wasn't going to stop me either. I didn't know it yet, but within 6 weeks I would harvest my first head of lettuce grown entirely inside that cave. And within 3 years, the people who laughed at the idea of my inheritance would be standing in line to buy food from the girl they once called nothing. The first winter, I wish I could tell you the first weeks in Blind Hollow were brave and determined. that I woke up every morning with confidence and a clear plan. The truth is much simpler. I was scared most of the time. The first night I slept in Marin's cabin, I barely slept at all. The wind pushed through the broken boards like someone breathing against the walls. The roof leaked in slow, steady drops that landed in a metal pan beside the stove. And the stove itself barely held a flame because the only wood I could find outside was still green from the damp forest floor. I remember lying there staring at the ceiling thinking about the orphanage. The oatmeal, the thin blankets, the girls whispering after lights out. I had hated that place for 7 years, but lying in that cold cabin, I understood something uncomfortable. The orphanage had at least been predictable. Blind Hollow was not. The next morning, I woke up with frost on the inside of the window glass. My breath hung in the air like smoke. I wrapped Marin's old coat around my shoulders and went straight to the cave with the journal in my hands. I had read almost 20 pages the night before. Marin didn't write like a poet. She wrote like a mechanic solving a problem. Every entry was careful. Dates, temperatures, diagrams of mirror angles, notes about soil mixtures. She had spent years learning how the cave behaved through every season. I followed her instructions the way someone follows a recipe when they have never cooked before. The first thing she described was the mirror system. 2 of the mirrors near the entrance had cracked long ago. Without them, the light reaching the deeper beds was weak. I didn't have new mirrors, but the journal suggested something else. Polished metal could work in an emergency. That afternoon, I took the small hand axe Mr. Aldridge had left and walked down the dirt road toward Sable Creek. The town was smaller than I expected. One general store, a post office, a church that looked older than the road leading to it. When I pushed open the door of the store, everyone inside looked at me at the same time. Small towns do that. People notice strangers. Mrs. Pute stood behind the counter. She was a narrow woman with silver hair pulled tight against her head and a face that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. "What do you need?" she asked. I bought seeds. Lettuce, spinach, kale. Things Marin's journal said could survive cooler temperatures. I also bought flour, salt, and a few tin cans because Marin had written that polished metal could reflect light well enough to help the mirrors. Mrs. Pute asked where I was staying. When I told her Blind Hollow, the entire store went quiet. A man near the stove coughed into his sleeve and turned away. Mrs. Pute's eyes narrowed slightly. "That's the Voss place," she said. "Yes," I answered. She handed me my change slowly. "That woman was strange," she said. "Some people said worse than strange." I didn't ask what she meant. I already knew the answer would not help me. The walk back to the hollow felt longer because the road climbed uphill most of the way. By the time I reached the cabin, my arms ached from carrying the supplies. I spent the rest of the afternoon cutting the tin cans into flat sheets and polishing them with sand until they reflected light. They weren't perfect, but when I mounted them where the broken mirrors had been, I could see the beam of sunlight move farther into the cave. That night, I planted the first seeds. Lettuce in the shallow beds near the entrance. Spinach a little farther back. Kale along the right wall, where the soil stayed slightly warmer, according to Marin's notes. Then I waited. Waiting is the hardest part of growing anything. Days passed slowly. I rationed the flour carefully. A small piece of bread in the morning. Another at night. When the bread ran out, I started eating what the forest offered. Dandelion greens. Wild ramps. Once I found a patch of strawberries, so small it barely filled my palm. I ate them anyway, and felt like I had discovered treasure. But the hunger never really left. Some mornings I woke up so dizzy I had to sit still for several minutes before standing. And every time I walked into the cave, I checked the soil, expecting to see nothing. Marin's journal said the first sprouts would appear around the 6th week if the mirrors worked well enough. 6 weeks felt like a lifetime when you were hungry. I remember the morning it finally happened. I had gone into the cave before sunrise because I couldn't sleep. The lantern light moved across the beds, and I saw something I almost missed at first. A tiny green line pushing through the soil. Then another. Then another. I dropped to my knees so quickly the lantern nearly tipped over. I touched one of the sprouts with the tip of my finger just to make sure it was real. It was the smallest thing in the world. But in that moment, it felt bigger than the mountains around me. Over the next days, more sprouts appeared. The lettuce grew pale but strong. The spinach leaves spread low across the soil. The kale took longer, but when it finally came up it looked stubborn, the way certain plants do when they decide they belong somewhere. I started spending more time in the cave than in the cabin. The cave held steady at around 55 degrees, even when the nights outside dropped below freezing. Marin had been right about that, too. The limestone walls held warmth the way a stone holds sunlight after sunset. 2 weeks later, the lettuce heads were ready. They weren't large. They weren't the deep green color of summer crops either. They were lighter, almost silver in the lantern glow. But when I cut the first head and bit into it, I had to sit down because my legs suddenly felt weak. It tasted like spring. That was the moment I realized the cave could truly work. But success rarely stays quiet for long. The first person to discover the cave was not someone from town. It was an old man with a shotgun slung over his shoulder and a beard that looked like it had been growing for 50 years. I heard his boots outside before I saw him. The door of the cave creaked open slowly, and he stood there staring at the beds of lettuce as if he had walked into a dream. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Then he stepped forward and touched one of the leaves with rough fingers. "I knew she wasn't crazy," he said quietly. I asked what he meant. The old man looked at me and smiled slightly. "Marin Voss," he said. "She showed me tomatoes in January once. I thought I imagined it." His name was Ezekiel Thorne. He lived 2 miles up the ridge in a small cabin left over from the coal mining days. He had worked underground most of his life, and his lungs carried the slow cough that many miners eventually developed. Ezekiel walked through the cave, slowly studying everything. The mirrors, the water channels, the beds of greens. Finally, he looked at me the way people do when they realize a puzzle has just made sense. "You're her," he said. I frowned. "I'm just trying to follow her journal." Ezekiel shook his head. "No," he said. "You're the only person in this valley stubborn enough to try." From that day forward, Ezekiel began visiting every few days. He brought tools the cabin didn't have. A shovel, a saw that actually cut straight. Nails for repairing the roof. In return, I gave him lettuce and spinach and mushrooms once I learned how to start the logs Marin described in the deeper chamber. He ate the first bowl of mushroom soup at my table one evening and leaned back in his chair with a look I will never forget. "Best thing I've tasted in 30 years, he said. And for the first time since arriving in Blind Hollow, I didn't feel quite so alone. The man who believed in the town that didn't Ezekiel was the first person in Blind Hollow who looked at what I was doing and didn't laugh. That alone made him different from most of the valley. The first few times he came by the cave, he didn't say much. He would stand with his hands resting on the handle of his shovel, studying the mirrors the way a mechanic studies an engine. Every so often he would nod slightly, like he was confirming something he had suspected years earlier. "She showed me this place once," he told me one afternoon while we were adjusting one of the metal sheets that replaced a broken mirror. Must have been around 1920. I was younger then, still working the mines full-time. She brought me in here and showed me tomatoes growing in the middle of winter. I looked at him. "And you believed her?" Ezekiel shrugged. "Didn't believe it, but I saw it." That was the thing about Ezekiel. He didn't care about explanations. He cared about what worked. Over the next few weeks, he became the closest thing I had to a teacher. The journal told me how the cave worked, but it didn't tell me how to live in the mountains. Ezekiel did. He showed me which would burn hottest in the stove. He showed me how to read the sky for snow. He showed me how to split logs so they wouldn't crack unevenly. He also brought tools from his shed that made the work easier. A shovel, a hand plow, a set of chisels for shaping limestone blocks when I needed to repair the beds. In return, I fed him. The lettuce kept growing. The spinach came in thicker than I expected. The mushroom logs began producing small clusters after about a month. They grew slowly at first, pale and quiet in the deeper chamber where no sunlight reached at all. The first time Ezekiel saw them, he let out a low whistle. "She figured out the dark side too," he said. "That woman understood caves better than the miners did. But word travels in small valleys whether you want it to or not." The first rumor started with a hunter. He passed through Blind Hollow on his way down the ridge and smelled something strange coming from the cave. Fresh basil. Marin had written in the journal that herbs would grow well in the reflected light once the mirror system was repaired properly. The hunter followed the smell and saw the beds. By the next week, the story had reached Sable Creek. At first, people didn't believe it. Winter vegetables didn't make sense to them. But hunger has a way of changing people's opinions. One Saturday morning, I decided to take a small basket of greens into town. The basket wasn't large, just lettuce, spinach, and a handful of mushrooms wrapped in cloth. I set it on a small wooden crate near the bridge by the general store. People walked past it slowly at first. Some stopped and stared. One woman picked up a leaf and turned it over like she expected to find a trick hidden underneath. "Where did you grow this?" she asked. "Blind Hollow," I said. That answer made 3 people nearby exchange looks. Mrs. Pute stepped out from behind the counter of the store and walked over. She studied the basket quietly. "These were grown today?" she asked. "Yesterday," I said. She picked up a mushroom and smelled it. "You're telling me you grew this in a cave?" I nodded. The silence that followed lasted longer than I expected. Finally, a man near the bridge spoke up. "That ain't natural," he said. A few others nodded. Another man laughed under his breath. But one woman stepped forward and bought the entire basket for 50 cents. She said her children hadn't seen fresh greens since October. That was the first time anyone paid me for food from the cave. The next week, I brought 2 baskets. The week after that, I brought 3. People were still suspicious, but curiosity is stronger than suspicion when winter lasts too long. Some customers came quietly. Others asked questions. A few refused to buy anything at all because they were convinced something unnatural was happening in Blind Hollow. The preacher in Sable Creek even mentioned the cave during one of his sermons. He warned his congregation about unnatural harvests in dark places. Ezekiel laughed when he heard about that. "Preachers always get nervous when someone solves a problem they can't explain," he said. But the truth was the cave worked. By the time spring arrived, I was producing more greens than I could eat myself. Marin's system was simple once you understood it. The mirrors caught a few hours of sunlight each day and spread it deeper into the chamber. The limestone walls kept the temperature steady even when frost covered the ground outside. The water channels fed the soil constantly with mineral-rich seepage from the rock. It wasn't magic. It was engineering. One afternoon, Ezekiel arrived with someone I had never seen before. She stepped out of his wagon wearing a brown coat and carrying a notebook. Her hair was tied back, and she had the kind of expression people get when they're about to solve a puzzle. "This is Ruth Calloway," Ezekiel said, "schoolteacher down in Sable Creek." Ruth walked straight into the cave without hesitation. She looked up at the mirrors first, then at the beds, then at the water channels. For several minutes, she said nothing at all. Finally, she turned to me with a wide smile. "This is brilliant," she said. No one had ever used that word to describe anything I had done before. Ruth spent 3 hours in the cave that afternoon asking questions about Marin's notes. She was the daughter of a mining engineer, which meant she understood angles and structures better than I did. Before leaving, she sketched a new mirror arrangement that would capture more light during winter when the sun sat lower in the sky. "If we tilt 2 of these mirrors another 10 degrees, she said, pointing to her drawing, "you could double the light reaching the middle beds." The next week, we installed the changes. Ruth was right. The cave brightened noticeably during the afternoon hours. Herbs began growing faster. The lettuce grew thicker. Even the kale looked stronger. By the summer of 1941, the cave was producing more food than I had imagined possible. The terraces outside the cave began producing as well. Ezekiel helped me build low stone walls to hold soil along the slope. I planted beans and squash where the sun reached strongest, but the cave remained the heart of everything. It produced food in every season. Even when frost returned in November, the beds inside stayed green. That was when the town truly began to pay attention. Because while every other farm in the valley went quiet during winter, Blind Hollow did not. On a cold morning in December, I set up my crate by the bridge again with 6 baskets instead of 3. This time the baskets were empty before noon. And for the first time since arriving in the mountains, I heard someone say something that made me stop walking. A woman standing near the store whispered to her friend, "Maybe that girl isn't crazy after all." I didn't turn around when I heard it. I just kept walking back up the road toward Blind Hollow with an empty wagon and a strange feeling growing slowly in my chest. Because the cave was no longer just keeping me alive. It was beginning to change the valley too. The valley that was hungry by the winter of 1943, the valley had changed in ways none of us expected. The war had taken most of the young men. Trucks rolled through Sable Creek every few weeks carrying supplies east toward the rail lines. The government bought nearly every sack of grain and every crate of vegetables farmers could produce. What remained in the valley was older men, women, and children trying to stretch whatever food they had left. That year the summer drought had been worse than anyone remembered. Gardens failed. The autumn harvest came in thin and weak. And by November the pantries in Sable Creek had begun to empty. I saw it first in the store. The shelves behind Mrs. Pute's counter slowly lost their usual clutter of canned goods. The flour sacks grew smaller. Sugar disappeared entirely. Even the jars of pickled beans that had sat untouched for years were suddenly gone. One afternoon, I walked in carrying a basket of greens and saw something I had never seen before. Mrs. Pute was counting potatoes, not weighing them, counting them one by one like coins. "Hard winter coming," she said when she noticed me watching. I nodded. I had known that for weeks already, because the cave had not slowed down at all. The temperature inside stayed steady, as always. 55 degrees. The mirrors caught their narrow band of winter sunlight and pushed it deeper across the beds. The mushrooms continued to grow quietly in the dark chamber. The spinach thickened. The kale grew stubborn and heavy. The cave didn't care about drought or frost or rationing orders from Washington. It simply kept producing. At first I did what I had always done. I brought baskets into town every Saturday morning and sold them near the bridge. But the line began forming earlier each week. Mothers arrived before sunrise, hoping to buy something fresh for their children. Old men walked down from the hills with small coins wrapped in cloth. I started lowering the prices without telling anyone. 50 cents became 40. 40 became 25. Some weeks I gave half the food away before noon. Ezekiel noticed it first. One evening he sat at the kitchen table watching me fill baskets for the next morning. "You're feeding people who laughed at you," he said. I tied a cloth around a bundle of spinach and placed it in the basket. "I know," I answered. He studied my face for a moment. "That bother you?" I shook my head slowly. "No," I said. "That's why it matters." Ezekiel smiled when he heard that. He had worked in the mines most of his life. The mines had taken his lungs and most of his strength long before I met him. But something about the cave seemed to give him energy again. He spent hours helping me repair the terraces outside the cabin. We built stronger stone walls along the slope so the soil wouldn't wash away during heavy rain. In the spring, we planted apple trees and berry bushes that would take years to mature, but promised something bigger than survival. But that winter belonged to the cave. By January, the baskets I brought into town had doubled again. 12 baskets now instead of 6. The line near the bridge stretched all the way to the church steps some mornings. No one called the food unnatural anymore. Hunger had settled that argument quickly. Children who had not seen fresh vegetables in months were eating salads in the middle of winter. The first time I saw a boy bite into a raw spinach leaf and grin like it was candy, I understood something important. Marin hadn't just built a garden underground. She had built a system strong enough to ignore the worst seasons. One night in late February, Ezekiel's coughing grew worse. He tried to pretend it was nothing, but I could hear the strain in his breathing every time he spoke. Black lung had been working on him for decades. The cold only made it stronger. I made him a pot of mushroom soup and insisted he stay the night in the cabin instead of walking back to his own place up the ridge. He sat by the fire wrapped in a blanket, staring quietly into the flames while the soup cooled on the table beside him. "You know something?" he said after a while. "What?" I asked. "This cave of yours, it's the first thing I've seen in 50 years that gives more than it takes." I didn't know what to say to that. Mines took coal from the mountains. Timber companies took trees. Even farms sometimes took more from the soil than they returned. But the cave felt different. It produced quietly without leaving scars on the land around it. That night, Ezekiel fell asleep in the chair by the fire. When I woke before dawn the next morning, he was still there, sitting exactly the same way with the blanket across his shoulders. For a moment, I thought he was simply resting. Then I noticed the soup on the table had gone cold, and his breathing had stopped. Ezekiel Thorne died the way he had lived, quietly, without fuss. I buried him 3 days later on the ridge above Blind Hollow. From that spot, you could see 3 valleys stretching out between the mountains. I planted rosemary beside the grave because Marin's journal mentioned that rosemary was used for remembrance. The winter ended slowly after that. Snow melted along the roads. The creek began moving again. People in Sable Creek talked about the cave more openly now, not with suspicion anymore, but with something closer to gratitude. One afternoon, 2 men from the state university drove into the hollow in a dusty car. Ruth had written to them about Marin's mirror system months earlier. They spent half the day walking through the cave, measuring angles, and asking questions about the soil. When they left, one of them shook my hand with a look of genuine amazement. "Do you realize what this is?" he asked. I shook my head. "A farm," I said. He laughed softly. "It's more than that," he replied. "It's proof that farming doesn't have to stop in winter." Word spread beyond the valley after that. Letters arrived asking about the cave. Ruth helped me write a small pamphlet explaining the basic ideas Marin had discovered. We called it cave farming. Most people ignored it, but a few didn't, and those few began traveling to Blind Hollow to see the place for themselves. The cave that once kept a single stubborn girl alive was slowly becoming something else entirely. It was becoming an answer, not just for this valley, but for anyone willing to believe that sometimes the places people dismiss as useless are the ones hiding the most potential. And standing there one evening at the entrance watching the last light fade across the mirrors, I realized something Marin must have understood long before I arrived. The world had been wrong about more than just plants growing in darkness. Sometimes the strongest things begin exactly where no one thinks to look. What grew in the dark the winter after Ezekiel died was the first season I truly understood what Blind Hollow had become. The cave was no longer just my strange inheritance. It had turned into something the valley depended on. Word about the underground farm traveled farther each year. At first it came in the form of letters. Farmers from other counties asking how the mirrors worked. A school teacher in Kentucky asking if mushrooms could grow in limestone caves there. A man from Pennsylvania asking if abandoned coal tunnels could be used the same way. I answered as many letters as I could at night by the stove, copying diagrams from Marin's journal and adding the changes Ruth and I had discovered along the way. During the day I worked. The terraces above the cave expanded slowly. Ezekiel had helped build the first stone walls before he died. I finished the rest one section at a time. Soil came from the creek bed below the hollow. I carried it up the hill in sacks, slung over my shoulders until the terraces were deep enough to plant trees. Apple trees first, then berry bushes. Crops that needed full sun stayed outside. Everything else belonged in the cave. By 1946, the system had become something larger than I ever expected when I first opened that rusted door. Summer gardens on the terraces, winter crops underground, mushrooms growing year-round in the deepest chamber, and herbs filling the cave with a smell so fresh it made visitors stop talking the moment they stepped inside. People came from farther away now. Some were curious, some were skeptical, but almost everyone left with the same expression. The quiet look of someone realizing the world was a little larger than they thought. That spring a car I didn't recognize drove up the narrow road to Blind Hollow. Cars rarely came that far into the mountains unless someone was lost. I was pruning the apple trees on the terrace when I saw it stop near the cabin. A woman stepped out slowly and stood looking across the hollow as if she was trying to understand what she was seeing. I knew her the moment she turned toward me. Mrs. Hargrove had grown smaller. Age had softened the sharp lines of her face, but I recognized the posture immediately. The same rigid shoulders she had carried through the halls of the orphanage. She walked across the grass slowly, her shoes sinking slightly into the soft ground between the terraces. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, she looked past me toward the cave entrance. "So it's true," she said quietly. I wiped my hands on my coat. "What is?" She gestured toward the hillside. The university bulletin mentioned a cave farm in West Virginia. I thought it had to be a coincidence. I said nothing. Mrs. Hargrove studied the terraces again. The apple trees were young, but already strong. The cave door stood open behind them with the mirrors inside, catching the afternoon sun. Her eyes filled with something I had never seen before. Regret. I came to apologize, she said. The words sounded heavy in her mouth, like they had been waiting a long time to be spoken. For what? I asked. She took a breath and looked down at the ground between us. Years ago, she said slowly, your Aunt Maren wrote to the orphanage. She asked if we had any girls who liked science, any girls who liked growing things. My stomach tightened slightly. What'd you tell her? Mrs. Hargrove closed her eyes for a moment. I threw the letter away, she said. I told myself it was nonsense. I believed girls needed practical skills. Sewing, cleaning, obedience. She looked back at the terraces, at the cave door, at the life that had grown here without her permission. I thought I was protecting you, she said. Instead, I closed a door that should have been open. The silence between us lasted long enough for the wind to move through the apple leaves above our heads. Finally, I said the only thing that felt honest. I found the door anyway. Mrs. Hargrove nodded slowly. Yes, she said. You did. I invited her inside the cabin and made tea from the dried mint hanging above the stove. She sat at the table looking around at the shelves filled with notebooks, seed jars, and maps of the cave system I had drawn over the years. The woman who had once believed curiosity was dangerous now sat quietly in a room built entirely from curiosity. Before she left that afternoon, I gave her a basket of food for the road. Fresh bread, mushrooms, greens from the cave. She hesitated before taking it. You're kinder than I deserve, she said. I shook my head. No, I told her. I'm just tired of carrying stones uphill. Life at Blind Hollow continued after that in the quiet rhythm the cave had always followed. Seasons turned. The terraces grew stronger. In 1948, a man named Thomas Wilder came to the hollow looking for work. Someone in Sable Creek had told him about the strange woman growing vegetables inside a mountain. Thomas had lost his left hand during the war in France. Many farms had turned him away because they thought he couldn't work properly. But when he stepped into the cave for the first time, he didn't look at his missing hand at all. He looked at the mirrors, then the beds, then the water channels running through the limestone. This place works with patience, he said, not strength. That was how Thomas stayed. We were married the following autumn on the ridge above Ezekiel's grave, while the mountains were turning red and gold with fall leaves. Ruth stood beside me during the ceremony. A few neighbors from Sable Creek came as well. It wasn't a large wedding, but it was enough. Over the next decades, Blind Hollow grew into something neither Maren nor I could have fully imagined. Thomas helped expand the cave with a third chamber designed with better ventilation and stronger mirror arrays built from automobile reflectors he salvaged from junkyards. The new chamber grew tomatoes in winter. Peppers, too, crops that no one believed possible underground. Young people began arriving at the hollow, asking to learn how the system worked. Some came from farms that had failed. Others came from mining towns where jobs had disappeared. We took them in as apprentices. The kind of children who asked too many questions. The kind who had never quite fit into the places they came from. By the 1960s, the small operation had a name. Ruth called it the Blind Hollow Agricultural Center when she wrote about it for the State University. 30 students passed through the program each year learning how to grow food in caves, abandoned mines, and mountain terraces. Visitors came from other countries to see the cave farm. Norway, Japan, Canada. They walked through the chambers, touching the warm limestone walls while lettuce and herbs grew under the reflected sunlight above their heads. Whenever someone congratulated me for the work, I always corrected them. This isn't my invention, I would say. It was Maren Voss who built the first seed of it. Thomas died in 1971 on a warm September evening, sitting on the porch where Ezekiel once sat. He watched the sun slide behind the ridge and simply didn't wake the next morning. By then, our children were grown. One became a teacher. One studied agricultural engineering. One became a doctor who returned to Blind Hollow every spring to help during planting season. They carried the hollow with them wherever they went. In 1975, the state of West Virginia declared the cave farm a historic agricultural site. In 1979, a documentary crew arrived to film the place. They asked me the same question people always asked. "Does it bother you?" The interviewer said, "working underground in the dark all these years." I laughed when he asked it. "Honey," I told him, "I spent the first 16 years of my life in the dark." An orphanage is darker than any cave. At least in a cave things grow. I died quietly in October of 1982. My children said I looked peaceful sitting in the chair beside the window with a cup of mint tea on the table and the autumn sunlight turning the cabin walls gold. The cave continued after me. My children and their children kept the terraces and mirror system working. More than 600 students passed through Blind Hollow over the years, learning how to grow food in places the world believed impossible. Marin Voss's journal now sits in a glass case near the cave entrance. Visitors often stop and read the first line she ever wrote, the line that changed everything. They will tell you that nothing grows in the dark. They are wrong. The dark is where all seeds begin.